All right, well, it is 9 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and call the Rail and Transit Subcommittee meeting for April to order. First item on our agenda is approval of our March 15 minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
A lot of votes. All right, easy enough. We're signing up. Next item is director's update. A lot. Big CTB meeting for us this month. We're presenting our fiscal year 23 budget and our 6-year improvement program. You got a preview of that on the transit side last month with an update on where we are with the capital prioritization. And you'll get full briefing on what's in the 6-year program today. Another thing that I wanted to mention is our 6-year program's been a static kind of PDF document for a long time. We will be releasing that 6-year program today on our open data portal, which is data.drpt.virginia.gov. So it's going to be much more interactive. We will roll that out in stages for fiscal year 23. So you can go in there, you can click on, we'll do a demonstration for you as well next month, but you can click on your district and it'll give you a drill down of all your agencies and the projects. Much easier for you to find things in your backyard than it's been in the past. Before the final, or as we work towards the final, we'll also be launching a Project Explorer, and that's where each of the capital projects has a page, there's mapping. You can look at FY22 and see that information. There's also information in there on time, on budget, milestones. So a lot of work has gone into that behind the scenes quietly during COVID. So we're able to release that new program today. So
It's data.ctb.
Data.drpt.virginia.gov. And we'll get that. We'll get
Yeah, just send them all.
We'll send them.
Email, that'll be great.
So that's something that I want to bring to your attention. It's a little bit different. Another thing I want to mention is we're tracking performance, tracking ridership across all of our systems. We are seeing some really good trends start to develop over the last month or so. We are seeing transit ridership creep up slowly but surely. Here in Richmond, GRTC, their ridership is above pre-pandemic levels at this point. Their local routes are doing very, very well. Largely, seen largely as the fact that they're zero fare. Other systems like Dash are doing very well. Dash did a whole system redesign during COVID, big endeavor, but I think those systems in particular show that, you know, this is a good opportunity for us to take a hard look at what we're doing and how we're providing service to make changes that better serve our commuters and riders. So we're seeing a lot of our transit systems
Dash
do that.
is zero fare too.
Dash is also zero fare.
Yeah.
Their ridership has gone up.
Dash is Alexandria. Oh, you guys already know.
Those of us that get you.
Yeah.
So they're doing very well. Another system that I'll mention, I think you've heard me talk before about our microtransit projects. We have one over on the Middle Peninsula area of Bay Transit. We have another one, Mountain Empire in Lee County, around the Wise area. The one with Mountain Empire was actually featured in a Reuters article recently. That project is doing extraordinarily well, making connections in a rural community. We're really proud of those projects. So you'll see some highlights like that in the 6-year program where we're funding more strategic planning work, more microtransit projects, really trying to tailor the services that we provide to the communities we're serving. On the rail side, BPRA's budget is on the agenda for the action meeting today. Steve presented that back in February, I believe. So that will come up for you for action today. Amtrak's ridership also is ticking up. We're seeing some really positive signs as things start to move coming out of the pandemic. Last one that I'll mention is our Virginia Breeze. That's our intercity bus service. Talk about that, great. So proud of that. We are seeing our highest ridership month since the pandemic. You'll recall we went into the pandemic with one route. We have come out of the pandemic with 4,
Right.
And they are doing really, really
The
well.
new ones are doing well.
The new ones are doing well.
Do you provide those statistics. I haven't seen that.
Sure, we can send you a package with the numbers. We do a monthly report and a quarterly report for Virginia. We can get you that one as well.
That's a great DRPT, but you kind of know what's going on with a lot of it.
So Metro ridership on the rail system has been going up slowly as well. You're seeing pretty consistent increases on the rail side. Bus ridership has been higher percentage-wise compared to pre-pandemic numbers in the rail. There's some challenges on the rail side with the 7,000 series cars being out of service. Metro's working on a solution, but it's going to take several more months before they think they're going to be able to get those cars back in operation, which will allow them to operate at a higher frequency.
Is the federal government still?
They are still primarily remote. They have not set a date for their workers to come back, and so that has a significant impact on WMATA ridership and all of our local transit systems in Northern Virginia and the Virginia Railway Express. So I think until we see that change, I think we're going to continue to kind of bounce along. But
there's a report out this morning that says that as of March 31, 39% employment in the DC metro area, which includes South America, is back in the office.
39%.
39%. That's up from 24% in January. So, it's moving that direction. I think your question is the most important factor in this. The federal government gets back. I think that the particular VRE is struggling.
It's going to continue to struggle.
And I think the thing that we all need to keep in mind is while ridership on some of our systems like VRE and PRTC is low right now because they primarily are serving commuters, we have to sustain that capacity because if everybody coming back to the office gets in a single occupant car and drives to wherever they're going, we're not going to get there. We're all going to be sitting. So we have to figure out how to maintain a balanced multimodal transportation system. We may need to make some changes and adjustments and I know we're already having conversations with a number of the transit systems around the state about being nimble and making adjustments to better serve their communities. We have to be able to do that because when everybody comes back to the office in some shape or form, we have to be able to have resources to serve them. So there's the silver lining on the WMATA front is that their ridership is going up. Their ridership is ahead of their projections, which helps from a budget perspective and ahead by quite a bit. So the second quarter of fiscal year 22, their rail ridership is almost 28 million compared to their forecast of 14 million. So from a budget perspective, that I think everybody's being very conservative in their planning. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and I think we're starting to see that bear out. So, okay, we're working on pulling a lot more. I'm giving you tidbits today, but pulling more ridership data to show that trend. It's very obvious when you look at the ridership transfer system like WMATA, you see the peaks and the valleys right along with COVID. And so as we kind of assess what's happened over the next couple of years and look at the path forward, we've got a lot of data to lean into.
Jen, you guys are connected to the Greater Washington Partnership that did the survey. They surveyed lots of private employers too.
We have a great relationship with them and work with them on a number of projects. So,
Yeah, because the feds are like 45%, I think, of the ridership, but the rest of it is companies and how they're going to approach bringing people back into the office. They have way more flexibility than internet.
Not for today, but for future meeting, we have a discussion, the implications of sustained reduced ridership on economics of transportation funding. Because they're projecting, at least from Washington Post perspective, they're projecting substantial deficits with WMATA. The question is which that can be made up. Maryland is starting to figure out what it is, what for today, but for future discussion, what that might look like in terms of how that affects the transportation convoy.
and with WMATA in particular, again, they use very conservative ridership forecasts in preparing their budget. So what you hear out there with their budget is typically a worst case scenario. We're already seeing things. We can definitely. So in terms of today's agenda, we have 2 items for you. Last month, when we presented on merit and capital program, we talked a lot about electrification. So Grant's going to give you an update on where we are with transit electrification, and then Emily's going to talk about the rail plan. Really excited. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grant. So while I moved into, I think we said this last time, while I moved into an acting role, I'm very fortunate to have Grant Sparks, who is our acting chief of public education. Pick up.
It's very big shoes. Do my best. Good morning, everyone. Again, Grant Sparks, I'm the acting chief of public education for DRPT. At the March subcommittee meeting, there was a comment made about transit fuel types, and there was an interest in learning more about the transit vehicles that we currently have in the Commonwealth. So we thought it was a good opportunity to give you guys an update on some progress that we've been making specifically with transit electrification. Oh, oops. I think we got it. So to start us off, there are over 2,100 transit buses in Virginia. They come in a handful of different sizes. About half of the transit buses are what we call heavy-duty buses. Those are your typical buses that you see that operate in more urbanized areas. You can see that in the photo. Moving down on the left-hand side, about a third of the transit vehicle of fleet is of the cutaway variety. These are also known as body-on chassis vehicles. These operate in both rural and urban areas. In rural areas, they are typically used for more on-demand service, and in urban areas, they're typically used for paired service. 10% of the fleet is coach vehicle. These are mostly used for commuter services. 4% are vans. These again are operated in both urban and rural areas, similar to the cutaway. They're used for on-demand services as well as pair transit. And then we have a handful of articulated buses, also known as bendy buses. These are operated in very urban areas or college campuses like Blacksburg. So in terms of the fuel types in Virginia, the majority of transit vehicles use diesel fuel. So it's 53% use diesel. And those are mostly those larger buses, whether it's the heavy duty bus, the coach bus, or the articulated bus. Those smaller cutaway style buses typically operate on gasoline as well as vans. We have 13% of our fleet uses CNG. GRTC here in Richmond, as well as Arlington Transit, they operate CNG vehicles. And then only 1% of the fleet is battery electric or other. The other is mostly propane. And the battery electric is what we're going to focus on today, because we see that, although it's only 1%, we see that number growing over coming years, and it's going to have an impact on.
Grant, just one quick question. That
Sure.
2,168 does not include metro buses.
No, it does not.
So it's everybody but.
Correct.
And it does not include school buses.
Correct. So, so we have 26 battery electric buses, or BEVs, in Virginia. And those vehicles are currently operated in 4 transit agencies. Dash in Alexandria has some, Hampton Roads Transit, Blacksburg Transit, and then John in the Charlottesville area. They all operate battery electric buses. Dash, Hampton Roads Transit, and Blacksburg Transit were the first agencies to put battery electric buses into operations. They received funding through the Volkswagen settlement that the Commonwealth administered, so they got their buses through that fund. And then Jaunt purchased their own. They have one battery electric bus, and that is actually the only bus in Virginia that is a smaller transit electric bus. So all the other ones operated by Dash, Hampton Roads Transit, and Blacksburg Transit are the large.
Grant, can I just add, the vehicles that are operated by Dash, Hampton Roads Transit, and Blacksburg are all manufactured to be electric vehicles. The Jaunt vehicle was retrofitted to be electric. So it's, four-year vehicle or seven?
It's a 4-year deal.
So that, from a technology perspective, the technology is far better for the heavy duty buses. We're just really starting to see it emerge in the heavyways and the vans.
And there's more than one company involved in the one.
Yes, there's at least 2, possibly 3. Proterra and New Flyer are kind of the big battery electric bus manufacturers.
Yeah, from the standpoint of concerns about the availability of new assets, timeline, yeah, just curious about where you're looking to go with the electrification. At the same time, do we have reservations anywhere to be able to apply what we're looking to acquire?
Some of that I'm going to get to in the presentation. I will say that the supply chain for all buses, not just battery electric buses, it's pretty delayed right now. Some agencies are reporting up to 3 years from the time that they order a bus to when it's delivered. So that's certainly a challenge for all transit agencies.
I would certainly imagine at the same time, the price of acquisition is increasing dramatically.
So, yeah, I'll get to that in a little bit, but with respect to the battery electric buses, before COVID and before the supply chain issues, battery electric bus costs were actually decreasing as the technology was getting better and as the manufacturers were improving their processes. So I think for battery electric buses, the prices have kind of flattened out a little bit, but you're right, typically, at least with the diesel buses, they tend to increase. So 26 battery electric buses in service today in Virginia. There are also 31 battery electric buses that have either been ordered already or have been funded and are waiting to be ordered. Those buses will be in more in Blacksburg, some for Fairfax Connector. Valley Metro has a few in the pipeline, as well as Loudoun.
One question. As a rule, if a diesel bus taken out of service because it's old, obsolete or whatever, is there a mandate that bus be replaced by a battery bus?
No.
No. If not, why not? I mean, has anybody ever thought about that?
But again, some of that, there's some pros and cons of going to electric. It's not just an obvious, we need to push to electric. There's definitely some concerns with all. So with 26 battery electric buses in the Commonwealth, how do we stack up against the rest of the country? This graphic shows the over 2,700 zero emission buses nationwide. I should point out that zero emission buses come in 2 varieties. It's both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell. There aren't many hydrogen fuel cell buses in the country. They're just a handful. I think most of them are operated in California. I want to say over 95% of the zero emission buses are battery electric. So as you can see on the map, we're not at the top, we're not at the bottom, we're somewhere in the middle. California has really been the pioneer for battery electric bus conversion. And I think that's mostly due to their pretty aggressive emission reduction goals. And they also are home to multiple BEV manufacturing. So, well, sure.
Why has Europe adopted hydrogen cells?
So it's a good question. I mean, I think the hydrogen fuel cell buses certainly show a lot of promise. I think it has something to do with the infrastructure. And I don't think this country has seen those infrastructure improvements yet. I think they also tend to be very, very expensive. So, so while BEVs are poised to have a number of benefits, adoption rates have been somewhat slow due to some legitimate concerns. Here's just kind of a breakdown of some of the common pros versus cons. The benefits to BEV conversion are fairly obvious. The environmental benefits, of course, with zero tailpipe emissions. BEVs also have very little or emit very little noise pollution. They're typically quiet on both the inside and the outside of the vehicle. Possibly the biggest benefit is that some data is suggesting that the total cost of ownership for battery electric buses from the time that they're purchased to when they are retired, that's the capital cost and the operating cost, are showing that they're lower than diesel. I put a star next to this because there's not a ton of data here. The first battery electric buses that were put into service in California, those are just now retiring today. And so we just don't have a ton of data. Over the next few years, there will be much more data. Federal government subsidies are also a big benefit. As you may know, the Federal Transit Administration is putting a lot of investment in low and no emission buses. And then also improve public perception. Battery electric buses do tend to look more modern. And so that could have a positive impact on public perception. The biggest issues for battery electric buses, first is the upfront capital cost. These vehicles typically can cost on average about twice as much as a diesel costs. There's also all the charging infrastructure that needs to be put into place, as well as if you're buying a lot of battery electric buses, you probably will need some facility retrofits to accommodate those. Additionally, one of the biggest concerns that we've heard from transit agencies are that these vehicles are less predictable in terms of their range and performance. Again, these are fairly newer technologies. The big issue with battery range is that it could limit route schedule. So some transit agencies have buses that operate 300 miles a day on average. And the battery electric buses, depending on the environment, might only be able to go 150 to 200. So the transit agency would either have to adjust their scheduling to accommodate, or they need to use a second vehicle to fulfill that scheduling requirement. So that's a very big one that I think is holding a lot of these transit agencies back from adopting battery electric buses, is the battery range. There are also knowledge barriers. These vehicles are not your typical, fill them up at night, just drive them out of the yard in the morning and they come back. These are very, very complicated vehicles under the hood, and they require a different skill set from maintenance crew. And then last but not least, Jen kind of pointed this out earlier, there's just limited small vehicle options. So rural agencies, for example, they just don't have a whole lot of options for battery electric. We've mostly seen the advancements in heavy-duty vehicles.
Grant,
Go ahead, Bob.
on your mileage range, with that one tank of gas for bus, diesel bus, 3 miles.
So a full tank of diesel gas can actually go further than 300 miles, at least in my experience. In my previous employer, we had the first vehicle would go out at 4:30 in the morning and come back at 2 at night, and it still had gas in the tank. So it could go pretty much 24 hours.
Grant, battery range is a primary objection to all electric vehicles right now. This is an evolving technology. What can you tell us about how far in the future it appears it will be before battery range will not be generally a concern for electric vehicles, relay buses, automobiles, whatever?
That's an excellent question. We have done some preliminary modeling for that. And it's really hard to say, especially with the supply chain issues right now. We're thinking that maybe in 3 to 5 years, there's going to be a tipping of the scale. Right now, a lot of the transit agencies that have adopted battery electric buses, they use a combination of both overnight plug-in chargers as well as on-route chargers. So the on-route chargers, they're really expensive. They're a little bit more bulky, but they're typically located at like transfer centers. And so when the bus goes out and does its route and it comes back to the transfer center to pick up more passengers, it'll have an opportunity to charge for 5 or 10 minutes. And that will kind of make the range extended a little bit longer so it can get through the day. And then at night it comes in and plugs in until it's ready to go in the morning. A lot of transit agencies are doing that, but we're thinking that the battery capacity, where it's headed, the need for on-route charging could be eliminated at some point, and then it will just be a plug-in overnight for a few hours.
Yeah, I think there are really two parts to that. One is range, and other is time to charge.
Right.
You know, you can go off a bus with petrol in 3 minutes or 5 minutes. If you have to plug a battery in for 2 or 3 hours, that's a whole different ballgame. And at least with what I'm reading is the work on batteries is addressing both concerns, range and time to charge.
Exactly. The charging infrastructure is progressing as well as the battery.
I've got two questions. One is there any manufacturers that are considering hybrids? In other words, if there's a backup fuel, if the battery runs low. And the second question I have is what is the shelf life on electric versus the standard diesel or gasoline?
So the second question first, the useful life in the transit industry, and that's what we use. For a heavy duty vehicle, it stays the same. It's typically 12 years for a diesel and it's 12 years for a battery. So the useful life is expected to be the same.
That's what.
Right, exactly. To your first question about hybrids, I'm not sure of any manufacturers who currently have battery electric as their primary source of energy and then have a backup, like a backup battery in place. I know that the hybrid vehicles, transit vehicles that operate today are actually diesel hybrids. So these are diesel vehicles. They have a diesel combustion engine, but they use battery electric propulsion technology. And so if you see a vehicle, on the streets, a transit vehicle, and it says hybrid on it, it's really a diesel vehicle, but it has high electric propulsion.
Where are these vehicles manufactured? Are they overseas? Is that what's creating the supply chain issue?
Most of them are actually American made. There are a lot of manufacturing plants over in California. The East Coast does have at least 1 or 2 manufacturing plants. I know there's one in South Carolina, there's one in Alabama, but most of them are on the West Coast.
And some of the supply chain is microchips and then for the smaller vehicles.
So the battery electric bus industry has come a long way since the first buses were purchased in California a little over 12 years ago. Just some trends, and we've kind of touched on these already, but BEV demand continues to increase. The cost per unit is expected to drop as manufacturing becomes more efficient, which is certainly promising. And then we just touched on this technology advancements in battery capacity and charging infrastructure is reducing those concerns on range. So in terms of the total cost of ownership, again, there's not a ton of data in this area yet, but some initial reports have shown promise in terms of the return on investment. In this graphic, you see the total cost of ownership for an electric bus on the left versus the diesel counterpart on the right. The blue is the capital upfront cost to purchase the bus. The orange is the fuel or electric cost. And then the gray is the maintenance cost. So it's a totally different dynamic. As you can see, the upfront cost for an electric bus makes up the majority of the total ownership. And the maintenance cost actually goes down quite a bit with the electric as there are fewer components.
And is this still that 12-year useful life expectancy?
Yes. So as you can see here, and this was a report done by Columbia University, they were expecting 170, maybe close to $200,000 per vehicle lifetime savings. So that might not seem like a lot over 12 years, but if you're a larger transit agency that has over 100 buses in the fleet, that will certainly happen. So while the data continues to evolve for battery electric buses, there have been a number of national studies that offer best practices in fleet conversion to battery electric buses. These are just a handful of those key considerations. First, goal setting is very important in understanding what the agency's motive is for electrifying. It's not always the same. Environmental stewardship may be the primary motive. It might be cost savings. It might be customer satisfaction. It might be all of the above. So setting performance measures to align with those goals is critical to a successful conversion. Number two, industry collaboration and research is critical for successful BEV deployments. Talking to other agencies who have experienced and have already received battery electric buses is very important. Most transit agencies are very accepting of site visits and welcome folks to come take a look at their battery electric buses. And the manufacturers of battery electric buses are also very open to bringing their bus and doing a live demonstration on the streets of the community. Number three, coordination with the utility provider to understand existing infrastructure and any limitations. This is, again, a very important step before battery electric conversion. Talking to the utility provider, understanding the current facility and maintenance yards and what the electric capacity is, and also getting an understanding of the rate modeling. That is very important, and I know Dominion and some of the other utility providers in the Commonwealth are happy to work with transit agencies on rate modeling. And then last but not least here, disaster planning. This is one that you don't really think about, but if an agency is part of a region's evacuation, say, the coastal transit agency, if they're part of the evacuation plan, a transit agency is going to need to think about how they evacuate everybody and then how they get back on potentially one charge. They may need to invest in a mobile generator to take with them. Yes, sir.
Yes, Brand, there's another dimension to it. I'm glad you included that. One of the issues, I-95, snowy event back in January, was the electric vehicles that run out of electricity cannot be recharged by someone coming along with a gas can, putting 2 gallons in the tank to get you off the highway. And it's not just snow and ice that does this, but if you had vehicles that stop in the summertime, they're going to have to keep the air conditioning running if people are going to stay on the vehicle. But sooner or later, they run out. And as you're saying, when they do run out, what are you going to do? It won't go anywhere.
Yeah.
That really, I think, I'm glad you're focusing on that, because that really needs attention.
Business opportunity for AAA, or the charters.
Yeah, don't call from the light.
I just have a question. Did you share this information with the Department of Education? Because some of the limitations of electric buses does not seem relevant. It does seem to be hurdles or barriers for school buses. Well, school buses do their route, they have a break, they recharge, and they can end their route again. Some limitations on commercial/public buses versus school buses. It seems like fleet transition from school buses would be no-brainer.
Yeah, that's happening.
Yeah, and I personally haven't had any communication with the Department of Education.
Cost is still a huge barrier.
I took a ride on one of those buses, like a school bus.
County wheel.
No, I didn't ride it, but so much to my surprise, so while the motor certainly is quieter, you still have all the attendant voices of the school bus.
So we have done some very high level cost estimation of what it would take financially to transition the entire statewide vehicle fleet to electric by 2045. Through this effort, we are estimating that it would cost $800 million, which is the incremental cost to convert transit vehicles to electric. Incremental cost means the difference. So really it's $1.6 billion total. 800 of that would be just to replace their diesel counterparts, but if you wanted to get to electric, it would be another 800.
Grant, do you know what part of our greenhouse gas impact is generated by buses?
I know it's very, very minimal.
Very minimal.
Yeah.
And this is a way quicker turnaround than can happen in the personal car.
Yes.
You know, this could happen quickly, but it's
It's very small. We have worked with VDOT on some of their GHG reduction projects, and anytime we work with them comparing it to highway, it's barely showing on the chart. But good question.
Is this estimate based on the useful life of vehicles? So as they're taken out of service, as they wear out, then they're replaced? Is that?
So yeah, the $800 million incremental cost would be for every single vehicle in the statewide fleet that is not battery electric. If we were to replace all of them.
Like a light switch?
Like a light switch, yes.
Okay.
That it would be 800. We wouldn't do it all in the same year because, as you mentioned, most of these vehicles are 12-year vehicles, and so you phase it in. And so that's why we have 2045. It's kind of like one of that's the target for.
The difference
for
between
that
replacement
estimate.
diesel versus replacement
Yes.
as they retire.
And then not only the capital cost, there's also the infrastructure costs. So we're estimating $300 million to design, upgrade, and install charging infrastructure. Typically, hopefully that would be a one-time thing, and you wouldn't have to, reinvest in charging infrastructure as much. But again, there's not a ton of data on the useful life of charging infrastructure.
and the thing beyond this is hydrogen.
Yes.
And what if the state decided they were going to focus on hydrogen and skip all this, upgrading the charging infrastructure and all that? I know there are some places in Europe that really lagged after World War II and never put in hardwired phones. They were able to just go straight to cell phones. And so there's a piece of me that wonders that, what would it look like if that was made?
I think we wondered the same thing.
Well, I would think that the shorter term availability.
Right, but if we were a market, if we said this is what we want to do, it might drive innovation here on this particular. I don't know what the safety, and I think the whole issue of school buses, there's way more school buses overall than there are these kinds of buses. So if you put those two things together, what would that look like?
Might push costs down.
I think we could drive innovation. It could be kind of a fun thing to do. But because the cost of these electrics is the barrier.
Yeah.
It's the barrier for school divisions, it's the barrier for local buses too.
If you briefly explain your graphing, right? Understand that?
Yeah, so through this modeling, we basically, we wanted to see what that conversion would look like. Again, we wouldn't do it all at once. So we took the current age of all the vehicles in Virginia and kind of stacked it up to see how could we gradually convert the entire fleet to battery electric by 2045. So you can see the gray is the non-electric fuel currently, and so you can barely even see the blue on the 2022 because we only have 1% as battery electric. And so we phase in over time more of the electric buses, which are actually the blue, orange, and yellow. The orange is the on-route, the percentage of on-route charging infrastructure. And then the yellow is the midday. Those are like the smaller vehicles. And again, those wouldn't probably even come into the statewide fleet until it's shown 2027 is when we think that those vehicles may be ready to convert. So it's not something that could happen overnight. It would have to happen probably over a number of years. And then the graphic on the left shows the average daily miles driven by each of the transit vehicles in Virginia.
So yellow, orange, and blue are all electric. Yeah.
Yes.
All
Yep, exactly.
just different models.
Right. So while the costs are daunting, there are a number of funding opportunities for battery electric buses at the regional level. Some urban areas get CMAQ funding, and battery electric buses are eligible under the CMAQ program. RSTP funding is also available for regions, and battery electric buses are available there as well. At the state level, I mentioned the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust Fund. It has been retired, and we've completed all the funding for transit. So
We did grab $2.5 million more from.
yes, it worked. So that has been retired, but the DRPT Merit Capital Program, we do fund battery electric buses through that almost every year. And then also Smart Scale. Battery electric buses are eligible under Smart Scale and actually score a tiny bit better than a diesel would.
Under regional, is the purchase of bus available in Hampton Roads, in Northern Virginia, in the Central District? I mean, we've got these regional authorities. So potentially those could be listed as a source of funding.
That's true. Yep.
I think the big takeaway for this slide is the piece at the bottom that in the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has a significant, very large amount of money set aside for bus facilities and low and no emission programs. And so one of the things that that bill requires is a zero emission transition plan. It's not an electric transition plan, it's zero emission. And that's something that we feel like we can really help our smaller agencies in the Commonwealth, and we're looking to do that on a statewide basis, working with the small urbans and the rural agencies to figure out how that accomplished. Something that's on our to-do list.
But following on some of the earlier discussions, is there any transition to school buses in this concept?
Not under the FTA legislation, just for.
Yeah.
Seems that there's not to get too optimistic developing with regard to infrastructure scale. You have infrastructure charging stations that can be used by public buses and school buses. Without having to duplicate the same infrastructure.
The Office of General Planning and Investment, along with the Research Council, did an electrification study, I think it was last year, and we spent a lot of time talking about how can you put resources in place that can be used by more parties than just one. So those conversations continue, but the more we can work together and leverage those resources, the more feasible it becomes. I want to be mindful of time.
Yeah.
Emily.
Yeah.
Yeah, again.
So
This hour committee meeting is like, oh my gosh.
Sitting there on a barrel.
So just one last point on the federal funding. Jim mentioned the bus and bus facilities and loan note programs. Those were just recently announced by FTA a few weeks ago. There's $1.5 billion available under these programs. So we are working with our transit agencies across the Commonwealth to try to go after some of this.
And you don't think you'll need anything in policy from us to support it?
So I do have one kind of bullet on here about policy. Starting at the very top though, we've done some of that preliminary modeling. We think that a next step is to really expand on that and do a statewide battery electric bus analysis, which we're hoping to kick off this summer at some point. We've already started scoping for that. We're also assisting transit agencies with their applications for those FTA discretionary funding programs. We may, or we will, be identifying policy changes that will encourage more applications for these programs with the hope of lowering both the state and local burden for bus replacements. So that is potentially a policy change that we will come to the board for as we work through the merit capital prioritization.
I would really encourage you to think about putting some kind of an incentive for a locality that's willing to work across their local bus and their schools. To try to get some jurisdiction or two jurisdictions to really kind of work through what are the issues and how, what would success actually. But I think you'll have to put,
Small communities. That would be great.
you'll have to put some sweeteners in there to make it happen.
And that's what we're, I mean, I don't, it's not so bad. Very quickly, Virginia agencies have been really slow to apply for federal discretionary money out of FTA. They like working with us, which makes us feel good. So we're trying to sweeten the pot for them to pursue this federal discretionary money. And I think we can wrap in some of that collaboration and partnership.
So just the last couple of points, we will continue to coordinate with utility providers in the Commonwealth. We have had recurring meetings with Dominion, and we look forward to more of those, as well as coordinating with the other utility providers. And then we will also be just keeping a close eye on the BEV industry in general, with just considerations of the longer term impact to our merit capital program, as well as our merit operating.
With a single source of energy, is there any concerns about cyber attacks and shutting down the grid?
It's a good question. I haven't heard of any increased cyber attack activity for agencies that have converted to battery electric buses. But I can certainly take a look and see if anybody's reported any increased issues with that. I haven't seen any.
I've always concerned with all my eggs in one basket.
No, it's a great question.
All right, thanks, Karen.
Yes.
David. Emily.
He's probably saying,
Any-
"Yay."
You have a petition happen?
So we will be coming to you regularly over the next several months with parts and pieces of the rail plan as we work to complete the update of the statewide rail plan by the end of the year. So Emily's prepared a very thoughtful presentation. We're short on time, but want you to kind of run through what you had. And anybody that wants to go do a deeper dive on this, we can certainly do that one-on-one or send you.
Right, so I was thinking that I would just go through it, and if we don't get through everything, then I will, there's always next month. So rather than try to rush through it too fast, I'll just talk about the items that are in front of me, and we can fill things in next time if necessary. So again, I'm Emily Stock, Chief of Rail for DRPT. And we've got a different kind of rail plan this year that's coming, and we're pretty far along now. Much of what the rail plan is a collection of data that the FRA requires us to put into the rail plan. The Federal Railroad Administration has some very specific guidelines, and generally when the rail plan comes out, it looks like a big encyclopedia on your desk if you have a desk version. Otherwise, it's a PDF that takes forever to download. Or chapter by chapter, you can download things, but it's a little tough sometimes to navigate through and find the data that you're looking for. So what we are using this time is we're using something called Arcgis story maps. I don't know if you all are familiar with Arcgis story maps, but the entire plan is going to be using this technology. It's going to look a lot like a website. And so we're excited about it. So it is a web-based application that allows you to share maps in the context of narrative text and other multimedia content. And it allows for dynamic storytelling. And the narrative is complemented by interactive maps. And you can explore data in multiple scales. So you can explore data at statewide level, at the regional level, and at the local level. And it helps answer the question, what does this information mean for me? So I'm going to So as we develop the story map, sections are linked on a main landing page, so you can still go chapter by chapter. And we can navigate sections seamlessly and actually read the chapter the old-fashioned way as well. And I'll show you a demonstration of what I'm talking about, actually in the next slide. So, are we going to is there there we go. Yeah, so this video shows you some of the basics. So you can scroll through the different chapters with the names of the chapters so you can understand the information. Now we've clicked on executive summary, going through information there, so you can see the graphics on the right-hand side, the narrative on the left-hand side, and some of the data points that we're highlighting in the executive summary. And then you can even go section by section in the executive summary. So, and then moving over to chapter 2, that's our existing rail system. So that's our baseline. And we can scroll through the chapter that way. And then look at some of these dynamic maps. And so this Virginia statewide rail dashboard has the most data. And we're right now clicking on crossings. So this shows all the crossings in the state. And then you can look at data for each one of those crossings. You can zoom in and, pardon me, these are, yes, at grade road and rail crossings. And there's a lot of interest in this. There's actually a program that FRA has through the IIJA to eliminate road and rail crossings. So we're trying to get ready for that by having this good dynamic data as we do applications for federal grants. So this actually shows rail crossing by land use. And what we're showing here is how you can get a hybrid map. Look at these maps with a road background. You can also look at an aerial background. This is a hybrid that has aerial and some of the transportation infrastructure, road names and route names. So there's a lot you can do with this platform. Rail crossing by position, so that would be road. There are some where there are great separations already. So road over rail, road under rail. So you can filter by lots of different characteristics. And this shows our freight corridors, and so it's a lot of the same information that you see in a typical rail map, but just easier to navigate through. Okay, is that the end of that one?
So Emily, I know we have a little bit of time. You know, the technology, I cannot believe it between when I first came in, we were talking about that last and this one. And so there's lots of ways we can drill down on specific questions we can ask, but a rail plan to me says there's a plan for where we're going to get to. We're going someplace. And I saw a brief set of goals. What interests me and what I think is most important about the plan is how does whatever's going to happen over the next 6 or however many years of this plan, how does that advance our VTrans goal? What if we are successful in living this out, what will be different in the state of Virginia when it comes to rail? And that, to me, that's the high level thing that we, CTB, need to always keep in mind. And then what are the things we need to do from policy, from funding, to make sure we get to that future? And so I can geek out on the technology with the best of them and, pursue my own individual interests. But what is it we're hoping to achieve with this? That's really where I think our attention should be focused. And we should make sure that the questions we have about that you know what those questions are.
Okay.
So.
Great.
Yeah, I would agree. What's the measure of success? Be successful in 3 years. What would that look like? Current state.
And so those are good questions, and that is part of the rail plan. We do 4-year and a 20-year analysis of projects. And we're in a situation right now in Virginia where we've been planning for rail for many years. We're in a great position. We have, a tier 2 environmental document for everything between Richmond and Washington, DC. We've got a lot of projects in the pipeline. So this slide here, I just skipped ahead of some of the data slides. This is our project identification slide. So we are taking into account the entire program of projects that Transforming Rail in Virginia includes, so the work that VPRA is doing. That totals coupled with other rail projects, with the freight projects that we have in the pipeline. We're talking about $5.8 billion in projects, 174 total projects, and we've broken those down by short term and long term. We're developing maps for that too.
So are those funded?
Some of it is funded, some of it is unfunded. And so we'll be identifying that as we go. And what is to marry up this project list and the data that I've been showing you, there are so many grant opportunities that are going to be coming our way. Some that VPRA is already applying for now, some that we're waiting for NOFOs on from FRA. We can use the data that all the pretty stuff that I showed you at first, the exciting stuff, in order to bridge that gap, and having this project identification done a short term and a long term, and then also understanding what the benefits of those projects are will be part of the plan. So with that laundry list of projects that are those coming from Transforming Rail in Virginia on the Western Rail Initiative, also 95 and 85 corridor down to Hampton Roads. We're looking at the benefits of those projects and figuring out where we can fill some gaps too for funding. Yes.
If you go back to that previous slide, what bothers me, next one before that, the one that had a number of passenger rail projects.
There you go.
I got 93 freight rail projects, got 81 passenger. Now, I know that the freight rail project, one, has the ultimate goal of getting trucks off the road. I assume that's that. But it bothers me that I've got 93 things where I'm subsidizing CSX and Norfolk. Is that what I'm doing? I mean, what are those freight rail projects? Who do they benefit?
So the reason that we do these benefit cost analyses is to make sure that we're benefiting Virginians. We benefit Virginians by taking trucks off of the road so that the roadway network is more efficient. We're making the most efficient use of our infrastructure. It also helps with pavement maintenance costs. So fewer trucks on the road.
I understand that, but by taking those trucks off the road, you're putting containers on trains and making Norfolk Southern and CSX money. I just don't understand.
But you're also bringing all of that freight in through the Port of Virginia. And one of the biggest benefactors of our freight program is the Port of Virginia. And getting that cargo into the Commonwealth, whether it goes out on truck or train, it benefits the Commonwealth by having those goods come into Virginia. And so we'd rather see them on train.
I agree, no question about it.
And so I understand. They're private companies, and finding that balance is important, but
all transportation subsidized.
Yeah.
If I may, I guess this is just a question of prioritizing which projects are really critical in terms of the program. So the question is, okay, which ones are? How do you get there? What's the criteria for looking at those particular projects?
So that is an important point, and that's another reason that we're collecting data. One of the maps that I skipped over was a heat map that shows the state of Virginia and the rail spurs for industry that exists within the state of Virginia, and co-locates actually highlights the industry and industry clusters that are most likely to use rail or to make more use of rail. So that when we go out and talk to the EDP, when we go out and go to our SIP hearings and have individual conversations with folks, we know what regions of the state are more prime for these types of projects where we can have the most effect. And I like the point that Jen made about the port. Dr. Smoot has asked us, through the recession, through COVID, with all of the supply chain issues and the horrible news that you hear of ports in California and other places, Virginia kept moving. And it was because of the percentage of rail that comes out of the Port of Virginia, almost 40%. And that's growing. And part of the growth can be attributed to partnerships with the railroads that are required to make a match when they apply for our program. So anyway, that's just another piece of information when you're thinking about freight.
Yeah, and also on the other side, keep in mind that funding for those projects comes to this board for approval. Those funding decisions are recommended to you based on the policies that this sends. So that, that ties it all.
And I'm just for the folks who are newer, because there's a lot of new people. In the last rail plan, we were not focused, in my opinion, on where are our opportunities. We were very responsive to who came to us and said, hey, we'd like this for here, or we'd like to do this. And I think that's sort of to me, that's the next generation is, there's been more understanding of ready sites that are ready for development, et cetera. And these heat maps are a piece of that, I would presume. But when we talk about crossings, when we talk about some of these other things that we now have on a map, everything isn't equal. And so where are the places that, from our perspective, we got to deal with? And then, if the federal grant doesn't come, then how do we decide where we're going to spend the limited resources we have to solve a problem? And I think that's kind of where what I'm looking for is we should seek as much federal money as we possibly can. And if this location stacks up better and they want to go for it, but it's not as critical, fine. But Arlington for years was very opportunistic. They'd wait for the development project to come to fix the sidewalk. And so you'd have development project. And in between those, people are literally walking in the street because there's no sidewalk. And at some point you say, this is unacceptable. And I think that's where we are, is we need to say this, we need this piece. And we're going to seek the funding any way we can, but this board needs to be aware of where those huge needs are, and so that we're thinking about it too. So, I think we did so much good work over the last number of years on sort of why are we doing this and what's the benefit to Virginia, and I doubt that and much of that needs to be changed, but I do think our intentionality as a board about these investments needs to adjust.
Further to Fred's observation, passenger rail in Virginia is essentially a public enterprise. Freight rail is essentially a private enterprise, which is controlled by shareholders. Has a very different agenda, that is delivering a financial return to the bottom line of a company, for-profit entity. I think I understand reasonably well that plan for passenger rail. It is a bold initiative, which I'm very supportive of. I have no idea what our plan for freight rail is, even if we should have it, because we don't own it. And that says we probably should have one. That's going to involve a very different conversation with two gigantic companies that are largely profit oriented. Largely, and yeah.
100%.
Well, well, I was being kind, but for another day, I'd like to hear what freight rail plan is what role the Commonwealth has in directing and suggesting the future of freight rail in the state, because it really does have a number of tie-ins, like getting traffic off highways and environmental issues and other kinds of things that are very much related. But I have no clue what it is.
That's a very good observation. But I would say that we do have a public interest in rail, even though to your point, they're private, because the implications of freight. We don't want more rail, but we want to keep trucks.
You heard the CSX next time say, our competition's not Norfolk Southern, our competition's trucks.
That's right. Yeah.
They operate on different lines, different rail.
Well, I understand, but his point was, even if they were on the same lines, their competition is trucks,
Right.
not other railroads.
What portion of the money that the state of Virginia invests on rail, since we're using the same tracks for cargo as well as passengers for safety concerns, is there any kind of maintenance requirements attached to the money that is that pretty much where it goes, or is it going for some other, it's just going into Norfolk Southern CSX pot and they distribute however they want?
The money that is part of our grant program, the freight grant program, and also the rail preservation program, it's for capital improvements. So there are improvements that would have demonstrated benefits for the state. And so we take them through a benefit cost analysis to make sure that there are benefits for the roadway network. And so they're capital projects of mutual benefit.
I took the first train from Norfolk up to DC when it first opened. And I know certain segments of that journey, they had to slow down because of concerns of the quality of the track. Is that still an issue?
So if there are, it could be that some of those tracks were being maintained by the class ones. They could have been under construction right then. There could have been some maintenance going on right then. In that corridor, you're talking about the corridor between DC and Richmond, or I'm sorry.
Norfolk and Richmond.
Norfolk and Richmond. And this is the Norfolk Southern corridor. I mean, I expect that the Norfolk Southern was probably doing its own maintenance work on the tracks.
So does the funds go a certain requirements for maintenance? Is that where the money from the state's going?
It goes to capital projects.
So it just goes into their pot and they distribute however they.
It's supposed to go for specific capital projects they present us with a budget. And there's a certain match that they contribute and a match that the state contributes. And then of course, if it's a federal funded project, there's federal funding in that too. And then there are, we monitor the project as it's being built as well, so that we understand that the money is going to that specific project with private bid. And if you're talking about passenger rail projects, I don't want to speak for VPRA, but a lot of those have been identified through our environmental documents and through work with the railroads to understand what kind of greater service we could get on a line where there's a shared corridor if certain improvements are made. So we work with them to model corridor and figure out where the pinch points are, and if there are specific capital improvements that are needed to make sure that there's additional or the necessary network fluidity for additional passenger rail, that's where those investments go.
So being mindful of time, we're way over. So I'm having some of you. So we'll put, I promise you.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of other items on next month's agenda that have to be on the agenda, so we'll let them later.
Some discussion happened on page 10 with the engineering caveat.
Okay. So I'm gonna look for, do we have any climate to public comment? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Emily. All right, nobody signed up for public comment, so we will. Sure.
Look,